Whenever I get ready to start a new painting, I stop and realize how lucky I am to live here in Central Oregon. The high desert is filled with forests, river basins, canyons, badlands, and so much more. When I go anywhere, I'm always looking at the world in terms of what will make a good painting. And these days, because my iPhone takes such great photos, I've always got a camera with me. So I've got hundreds and hundreds of photos. Sunsets, landscapes, river shots, almost anything can make a good painting. When taking photos, I'm using the camera like a sketch pad, composing the shots as I go, always looking for scenes that will make the most dramatic images. Sometimes all I have to do is look up. The high desert has the most amazing skies, especially if it's storming outside. So I think for my next painting, and the first painting in this series, I'm going to do this cloudscape, and I'm going to call it Stormy Skies over Bend. Okay, so I've selected the image I want to paint. Now I just have to get it onto the panel I'm going to use for the painting. The first step for that is I have to edit the photo. I use Photoshop for this, but any photo app will work just fine. I scale the image to the size I want for my painting, in this case 8 by 6 inches. One of the things I love about modern digital photos is their aspect ratio is just right for these small paintings. Then I change it to grayscale. For the first coats of paint, I'm not worried about color, only the light and dark values of the image. Then I print it. A huge advantage in working small is that you can use any standard 8.5 by 11 inch printer. Don't worry about the quality of the image. At this stage, we don't care. It just has to be clear enough that you can see the basic shapes. And use the cheapest paper you have. It will make transferring it to the panel easier if you're using thin, cheap paper. Next, I select the panel I'm going to use. I always paint on Masonite, which I buy in bulk, pre-cut from places like Amazon or Dick Blick. Masonite and other brands are a type of hardboard that is very smooth and durable. I prime them myself using several thin coats of gesso, sanding between each coat until the surface has the smooth texture of an eggshell. Once your image is printed, you trim it to size and tape it to the panel. This is important because you don't want the image slipping around on the panel surface while you're transferring it. Any type of tape works fine for this. I like to use professional graphite transfer paper. This is made by several different companies and comes in rolls or sheets. I've used them all and they all work fine. Don't use carbon copy paper as it has chemicals that can hurt the oil paint. I trim these to size and use them over and over again to transfer images to my painting panels. Once the transfer paper is trimmed, place it between the image and the panel and you're ready to go. For transferring the image, I use Color Erase red pencils. The red lines against the black and white image make them easy to see, and this brand of pencil has a durable lead that won't break easily. Be sure to do a small test mark to make sure the correct side of the transfer paper is facing the panel. I've made that mistake before and have had to redo entire transfers. Then start scribbling away. The goal here is to work very quickly. I'm speeding this up for the video here, but the entire process took less than 5 minutes. The reason this is important is you don't want to worry too much about the details. Work loosely and broadly, capture the shapes, the edges of light and shadow, but don't worry if you mess up or make a mistake. At this stage, it's kind of really impossible to make mistakes. The key to this style of painting is that at every stage we're adding a layer of impression. Our goal is not to recreate the photo. There isn't much point to that because, well, we already have the photo. We want to do something that has more feeling and more of us in it. By the time we're done, the panel is covered completely by all these squiggly lines, which at this point look like an incomprehensible mess, which is perfect. Next, we have to seal the panel surface. I use Damar retouch varnish for this because it will coat the entire panel and create a surface that is perfect for oil paints. Just shake the can well, and then keeping it about 12 inches or so above the panel, Spray the surface until it's completely covered. You don't need a thick coat here, just enough to make sure the image is sealed. I do this outside because the vapor from this stuff can be really harmful to your lungs. If you spray any kind of varnish inside, make sure your space is well ventilated. Once complete, I wait for it to dry completely, which can take up to a few hours. Now that the image has been transferred to the panel and the surface is completely dry, we can finally start the underpainting. Our palette for this is really simple. I use titanium white, which I buy in large tubes. Again, there are lots of brands of oil paints out there. I've used them all and they're all fine. Then a small amount of burnt umber for the really dark shadow areas. Again, I tend to go through a lot of this stuff, so I buy it in large tubes. Finally, I use Payne's Gray for my medium and dark areas. I try to avoid lamp black and other blacks because they seem dead to me on the panel surface. I use a custom fast-drying medium to mix my paints. This is a recipe I got from the famous Disney artist Carl Barks, and is a mix of stand oil, Damar varnish, and turpentine. And finally, I use regular odorless turpentine for thinning and cleaning my brushes. For all of my paintings, I use round and synthetic brushes ranging in size from 0.0 to 2. For the underpainting, the more gnarly the brush, the better. Now, finally, we get to the fun part. As I mentioned earlier, at this stage, we're not concerned with color at all, only values. The entire underpainting will consist of really just 3, light, medium, and dark. I usually start with the lights. I load the paintbrush up with white and a tiny amount of Payne's Gray, and then just start blocking in the light areas of the clouds. Again, I'm going to speed this up for this video, but like transferring the drawing, the goal is to work very quickly. The entire underpainting took less than 40 minutes. After blocking in the whites, I move to the mid-values and really start to define shapes. I use the squiggly lines of the transferred image as a guide only, and I begin to get into a rhythm. I load the brush with paint. You can see how I'm starting to get a wide range of grays here now. Then I glance over at my source photo. I keep a monitor next to my easel just for this purpose, and decide which shape I want to paint next. Then, back at the panel, the brush never stops moving back and forth, defining edges of light against shadow, areas where cloud and sky blend together, areas where deep shadow begin to push up against the edges of the clouds. Then, back to my palette for more paint, back to the photo source to find another shape, back to the panel to define another squiggly line. Again, the goal is not to copy the photo exactly, but to use it as a guide. A lot of detail is going to be lost, but that's okay. That's actually the goal. We want to capture the essence of what we're seeing, capture the feeling of it, but do so photorealistically. Once the sky is almost done, I block in the tree line very roughly. The large trees on the left side, I'm going to ignore completely. I'll paint them in once the sky is dry. And again, for the most part, we're not worried about detail down here. Just the basic shapes. In the final painting, I'll use a 0.0 brush to go in and really define these trees. 40 minutes later, the underpainting is complete. In some ways, it really is the most important part of the process. It's here where we establish not just the forms and shapes that make up the entire composition, but the darks and the shadows. Dramatic lighting is what creates drama in any painting, and this is the stage where you will decide exactly what that's going to be. After letting the painting sit for a couple of days, I check to see if it's dry enough to start the final painting. Drying can take up to a week sometimes, depending on how much medium you use. Thick white paint especially can take forever. This is one reason, as you can see, why I have multiple paintings going at once. While one's drying, I can work on something else. But good news, the underpainting is dry and I can start on the color layers now. The first thing I have to do is go back to my photo source and edit the color version. Again, I use Photoshop for this, but any program will do. I adjust the vibrance and saturation, really pushing the color. Digital photos are great at a lot of things, but sometimes color just gets washed out. The same thing can happen with contrast. The tree line here, for example, is really too dark because the camera has trouble adjusting exposure for the bright sky and dark trees at the same time. For other unwanted details like this kiosk in the foreground, there's no point in editing the photo, since I'm just using it as a guide and I can ignore it while I'm painting. Next, I set up my palette. For this painting, the sky's final color is very similar to the color scheme I used for the underpainting, so I'll keep using titanium white and Payne's gray. But I'll also add a touch of phthalo blue for the sky color and cadmium red deep to add a bit of purple to the shadow areas of the clouds. Most of the painting will be done with double-aught synthetic round brushes. I use these older gnarly brushes for blending and newer brushes which can still be shaped to a fine point for detail work. This gnarly number 2 brush is still great for spreading color and blending large areas of paint. I start with the new double-aught brush, loaded up with phthalo blue and Payne's gray. My process here is almost the opposite of the underpainting. For these final coats of color, I start with the darks and really begin to define these edges where the clouds meet the sky. For this phase of the painting, I pay close attention to the source photo. Again, I'm not copying it exactly, but using it as a guide as I define edges, feathering in these wisps of cloud. I paint in broad areas of darks all over the sky. The underpainting provides a solid framework of lights and darks, but everywhere it needs to be refined as I add shadow areas, define cloud formations, tighten some edges while blurring others. At the same time, these new layers of paint are adding to the existing dry layers, creating a subtle impasto texture that picks up the light above my easel. I love how you can see the brushstrokes in the paint. I try to keep them small and fluid, moving in the direction of the lines that define the clouds. The paint itself and how it's worked on the panel is one of the key things that make this different from a photograph, which can perfectly replicate nature and doesn't really need your help. The painting doesn't exist unless you bring it to life with your brush. Looking at my palette, you can see that a very small amount of blue and red go a long way. Already, I have a nice range of colorful grays. While painting, I like to find one or two features which really stand out and can make the painting unique. At the risk of sounding like the late painter Bob Ross, who I love, I decided to put extra work into this happy little cloud here near the horizon. I love the way it's backlit and use my small, fine brushstrokes to carefully enhance these edges that define the masses of dark against the sky. It's small, dramatic details like these that will draw the viewer's eye into your painting. But again, you want to work quickly so you don't get hung up on too many details. Even for a simple cloudscape, the structures of these massive shapes are impressively complex. You could spend days here exploring them, but altogether, I've spent just over an hour and the sky is done. For the foreground palette, I add a little phthalo green and cadmium yellow pale. Again, I'll use these in very small amounts as a little color goes a long way. Next, I adjust where the painting is sitting on the easel. I stole this ingenious easel design from that same Disney artist I mentioned earlier, Carl Barks, who was also an inventor. It's basically a large pegboard. Your painting rests on these hooks, which can be placed anywhere vertically and horizontally, making painting detail work like this much easier. While this tree line in the foreground isn't the focus of the painting, it's important for one reason. It literally, if you'll excuse the pun, grounds the sky, giving it context and a sense of scale. All the detail work is again done with these fine double-aught brushes, which allow me to go in and define the structures of these trunks, branches, and masses of leaves. You can see at this point why I wasn't too concerned about doing any of this in the underpainting, because to make the trees convincing, you have to pull them up past the horizon and into the sky. You really don't want to do that until the clouds are finished. Details below the skyline, for the most part, become mere suggestion. Just a little bit of color here and there can suggest shrubs, smaller trees, scrubland. This technique, pioneered by Bob Ross, who I mentioned earlier, and many other artists, is a way of adding detail that is subtle but convincing. Just remember, you're not going to be able to paint every leaf, and again, you don't want to. We're just going to suggest overall shapes and forms. The double-out brush really helps for creating these tiny strokes that can represent very small organic masses of color. But you do have to be careful. The temptation is there to start painting individual leaves, and you really don't want to do that. For the left side of the foreground, I knew that I wanted to have a couple of trees that really break the horizon line and jut up into the sky. I mentioned that when I'm taking photos, I use the camera like my sketch pad, composing the shots as I go. I deliberately framed this shot with those trees on the left. Artists argue all the time about the rules of good composition, dynamic symmetry, and all of that. For me, it boils down to making the image interesting. You want it balanced, but not symmetrical. In some ways, painting these large trees is the scariest part of the process. You just have to trust yourself and lay down the bold strokes of paint. You can wait until the sky is completely dry before doing this to mitigate some of the risk. That way, if you make a mistake, and it is possible to make mistakes here, you can just wipe it off and try again. With enough practice, though, you get confident in your brushstrokes. You know it's not going to look right when you first start, but over time, as you build up more branches, masses of leaves, distant tree shapes, foreground masses of color, and so on, eventually you have something that looks convincing, something that looks like a tree. Once I'm happy with the overall shapes, I'll go in with a little sky color and touch up the tree line. The goal here is to look for blocks of paint that are too large, to break up dark areas with bits of light, and bring small parts of the sky down past the horizon line and into the foreground. Once those details are done, the coats of color are complete. All told, the process took just over 2.5 hours. Now all I need to do is sign it. Again, one of the things I learned from Carl Barks is that your signature is one of the most important parts of your painting. You want it to be legible, so patrons will know who you are, especially today, when they can find your portfolio online. Your signature is your brand. I usually think about where I'm going to place my signature well in advance, and try to leave a space that has a little less detail. Choose a color that is harmonious with the painting and not so bright that it grabs too much attention. The rabbits on most frames are 1/4 inch, so make sure your signature is at least that far from the painting's edge and bottom. Finally, the painting is complete. Now I have to wait a couple of weeks until it is completely dry, then I'll add a thin coat of Damar varnish on top. If you compare it to the photo source, you'll see that it really is quite different. We've used the photo as a guide to create a cloudscape that has more feeling, more of us in it. And in the end, that's what we want from art, an expression of who the artist is and how they feel about the world around them. Okay, that's it for this first video, Stormy Skies over Bend. Thanks for watching, and if you're interested in more of my thoughts on video games, oil painting, cartooning, and much more, consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks.